Hello. Last time around, we started talking about the topic of sexual perversion, which, as I hope you know, is the second of our topics under our second unit, which is on the philosophy of sex. Now, remember, a sexual perversion is simply a sexual act that's unnatural, right? It's a sexual act that's understood to be a distortion of nature or a deformity of nature, something like that. Now, last time, we started talking about Thomas Aquinas, the medieval Christian philosopher, because we're looking at the concept of sexual perversion as it appears in his work. But last time we didn't talk about what he says about sexual perversion. We just laid down the groundwork, right? We looked at sort of the basis of Christian sexual morality. But then today, we're going to move on to the topic of sexual perversion. And what I'm going to say about sexual perversion is going to fit into a story that I'm telling you. Okay, the story that I'm telling you over the history of Western thought about how our way of thinking about sexual morality changes, right? How it transforms over the course of the last, 500 years or so. So here's what I want us to do for today. So we're going to keep talking about Aquinas' treatise on the cardinal virtues, which we began last time. And we're going to talk about first what he thinks about marriage, okay, and the relation he sees and that he argues there is between sex and marriage. Okay, so how marriage fits into this whole story we've been telling about Christian sexual morality. And then after that, we're going to move on to what he says about the unnatural vices. And this is exactly what I'm calling the sexual perversions. Okay, vices that are understood to be unnatural. And then we're going to move on to analyzing what Aquinas says in his treatise on the cardinal virtues. We're going to look at what he says about sexual ethics broadly and what he says about sexual metaphysics. Okay, we're going to look at how these two things in his work are intertwined, how his ethical view depends on a certain understanding of metaphysics. And here we're going to do something that we haven't really done much of so far, which is we're going to start evaluating arguments. Okay, we're going to look at why it is that Aquinas thinks that certain sexual acts are perversions, why it is that he thinks that they're unnatural. And we're going to look at his argument for that and ask questions about, whether this argument holds up. Right? Does he have good reasons for thinking that some sexual acts are in some way unnatural? So today we're going to finish our topic on sexual perversion. We're also going to finish talking about the Middle Ages, which is the period that we've been in for a little bit over a couple weeks now, such that next time we're going to move on to the modern period. And I just want to highlight, although we're going to stop talking, we're going to finish talking about the topic of sexual perversion today, the concept will come back. Okay. And one thing to keep track of as we talk about the modern period through Kant and Mill and Foucault is how our understanding of perversion changes and how it becomes difficult to even maintain the idea that there is such a thing as a sexual perversion. So first things first, let's talk about Aquinas' treatise on the cardinal virtues. Again, this is part of the Summa Theologica, and it's a part that we started talking about last time. What we talked about last time is that there is in the Summa Theologica, there is in the treatise of the cardinal virtues, a reliance on natural law theory. Okay, we saw that Aquinas' view of sexual ethics relies on a particular normative ethical theory, which is a kind of natural law theory. Right? We saw that Aquinas thinks that an act is sinful if, or maybe we should say only if, I'd say that's not entirely clear, but an act is sinful at least if it violates the rational order of nature. Okay, the idea is there is a rational order in nature that was placed there by God, and an action is morally impermissible, right? That's what it is to say that it's sinful if it violates that order that is there in nature. Whereas if an act does not violate that order, then it's morally permissible. Okay, that's Aquinas' general view. And so it relies on the view that there is an order in nature that was put there by God. That there is a set of purposes in nature. Right? God made natural entities to have a certain purpose, and to use them for the right purposes is morally permissible, and to use them for the wrong purposes is morally impermissible. And we saw last time as well that this connects up with a certain view of sexual ethics, right? Because from this perspective, the reproductive organs, the sexual organs, have a purpose, and their purpose is to reproduce. And so other uses of them are always sinful, right? That's what we saw that last time. And because they have an aim, they have an object, right? Which is a person of the opposite sex. Your sexual organs, in some way, by virtue of their purpose, are directed at a person of the opposite sex. And we can say more specifically, not only do they have an aim, which is reproduction, and so an object, a person of the opposite sex, but they have a characteristic action, right? There's an act that they tend to, which involves genital contact with the genitals or with the sexual organs of a person of the opposite sex. Okay, we saw that what you have in Aquinas is a very, very restrictive view of sex. Every act of lust is sinful, according to Aquinas, right? Remember, lust for Aquinas means acting out of a desire for sexual pleasure. This is opposed to concupiscence, which is just feeling sexual pleasure. Lust is sinful, right? Having sex for the sake of pleasure, according to Aquinas, is always sinful because the purpose of the sexual organs is not to give us pleasure. Their purpose is to reproduce. Of course, we're going to feel pleasure when we use them to reproduce, and that's fine, right? The pleasure is not sinful. But using them just for the sake of pleasure is always going to be sinful. That said, I pointed out, it's not always going to be sinful to the same degree, according to Aquinas. And I gave you a bit of a spoiler, and I said it's not going to be as bad, right? Lust, acts of lust, meaning sexual actions that you undertake for the sake of pleasure, are not going to be as bad if you're married. Okay, they're going to be less sinful. So that's what we're going to get into now. Okay, what Aquinas thinks about marriage and how marriage comes into this whole story. So remember, the Summa Theologica is a series of questions, right? And then Aquinas considers arguments on both sides, and then he presents his answer to the question. And so the first question of his that I got you to read in the second excerpt and that we're going to talk about today is fornication always a sin? Fornication simply means sex outside of marriage, right? Sex that occurs outside of or before marriage. So if you hook up with someone, right, and you have a casual one-night stand with them or something, that's fornication. If you have like a friends with benefits, right, and you have sex and you're not in a serious relationship, that's fornication. Even if you have a serious partner and you have sex but you're not married, that's fornication. Okay, so he's asking, is fornication like that, sex outside of marriage, always a sin? That is it always morally impermissible? And he says, yes. Okay, it always is. According to Aquinas, it always is. Here's a quotation. He says, without any doubt, we must hold simple fornication to be a mortal sin. Okay? Fornication is always a mortal sin. Remember the distinction between mortal and venial sin. A mortal sin is a very grave sin. Why? Well, he says, every sin committed directly against human life is a mortal sin. Any sin where you're in some way injuring human life, attacking human life, is going to be a mortal sin. Now, he says, simple fornication implies an inordinateness that tends to injure the life of the offspring to be born of this union. Okay, you're hurting someone when you fornicate, when you engage in fornication. You're at least potentially, I should say, hurting someone. It's evident that the upbringing of a human child requires not only the mother's care, but much more the care of his father. Hence, human nature rebels against an indeterminate union of the sexes and demands that a man should be united to a determinate woman and should abide with her a long time or even a lifetime. Okay, what is he saying here? Well, he's saying human beings are a particular kind of animal. They are the particular kind of animal, or they belong to the set of the kinds of animals where both parents are needed to raise offspring. Okay, there are some animals where the male engages in sexual intercourse with the female, fertilizes her, and then disappears, right? But then there are other animal species where once the male and the female enter into a sexual union, they stay together and care for their children together. And he's saying, well, human beings are one of those species. Okay, so by nature, human beings are the kinds of species where both parents are required to take care of the offspring. Meaning that anytime you have a sexual interaction with somebody you're not married to, right, somebody you haven't committed to staying with in the long term, well, you're potentially injuring a human being. You're potentially injuring the child. right? Because you might produce a child from that union. And if one of the parents is not around for that, specifically if the father is not around for that, he injures the child, takes away something that the child needs. And so, for that reason, any child outside of marriage, right, any child where there hasn't, where a lifetime commitment has not been made, where the parent is not committed to, or both parents are not committed to staying in the long term, is a mortal sin because it violates the inherent order of things. Again, there is, according to Aquinas, various purposes in nature that you can see, you can grasp just by observing how things are. And according to him, if you observe how things are, well, human beings are the kinds of species where you need both parents in order to raise children. And so, any act that fails to respect that, any sexual act that risks producing a child but without having both parents there to take care of the child, is going to be sinful. Okay, going to be sinful by virtue of the fact that it injures a child, injures another human being, which is contrary to the rational order of things. So what's Aquinas' argument here? Let's try to reconstruct it carefully. The first premise of the argument, clearly, is that actions that offend directly against human life are always sinful. Right? If you do something where you are knowingly injuring another human life and directly injuring another human life, right, not as a side effect of something else that you're trying to do that's good, then that action is always going to be sinful, Aquinas is saying. The second premise of his argument is that sexual acts performed outside of marriage, in fact, do offend against human life, right? Again, in a sexual act, you risk producing a child. And according to Aquinas, that child needs both of its parents in order to prosper, in order to flourish, in order to live a good human life. But if you're not married, you risk producing a child without the assurance of that context of having both parents, right? You are purposely risking that scenario, knowingly risking that scenario, knowingly risking harming the child. And so it follows, right? If the first premise is true, if it is true that any action that offends directly against human life is sinful, and if the second premise is true, and if it's true that sexual acts performed outside of marriage offend against human life, then it follows deductively, it follows necessarily that sexual acts performed outside of marriage are sinful. It follows necessarily that it's morally impermissible to have sex outside of marriage. Okay. Notice this relies on what we saw last time, right? According to Aquinas, sex must be had for the sake of children, right? For the sake of reproduction. Why? Well, because what makes an action right or wrong is whether it accords with the purposes that are there in nature, right, with the rational order of nature, and the purpose of the sexual organs is to reproduce. And so whenever you're having sex, if what you're doing is not going to be sinful, it must be that you're doing it for the sake of children. But raising a child outside of the context of marriage is going to harm the child. And so sex is only ever permissible within a marriage. Now, again, according to Aquinas, an act that is a sexual act that is for the sake of pleasure, right, an act of lust, is always sinful. But he thinks within the context of marriage, it is less so. Why? Well, because at least in that case, you have committed to the kind of union where if you do end up producing a child, then that child will be taken care of, right? You've committed to the kind of union where it is okay to produce a child. And so if you end up having sex for the sake of pleasure, it's still sinful, but much less so. Okay, this relates to what I want to say about why marriage is good, according to Aquinas. Remember, we saw last time that marriage is one of the 7 sacraments in the Catholic faith. It's a sacrament, meaning it is a visible sign of invisible grace. It's a visible sign, something you can see with your eyes, right? An event in the physical world. But what it really is a sign of something that God is doing, which is, of course, outside the physical world. And so marriage as a human institution is created by God. And when two people get married, what is really happening is not that the priest is doing something, but that God is doing something. He is uniting them in a special kind of bond. This is what it means to say that marriage is sacred. And of course, God is good. And so if he created marriage, it must be because it's good, right? It's got to be good for someone. Otherwise, he wouldn't have created. And so what I want to talk about now is why marriage is good. Well, it's good for two purposes. Okay, so it's good for two reasons. Now, remember, from a Christian perspective, we are all fallen, right? The entire world exists in a state of fallenness. It was made in order to share in God's goodness. We were made in order to share in God's goodness. But then, through the first sin, as the first sin entered the world fell. It is now in a state of separation from God. And so it is in various ways imperfect, right? It falls short of what God wanted for us. But Aquinas would say that even if we weren't fallen, right, even if we had always remained in a state of perfect union with God, well, marriage would still be good. Marriage would still be good because it would be good for raising children, right? It's the appropriate context for raising children. Human babies, Aquinas thinks, need both parents in order to flourish. And so even if we hadn't fallen, marriage would be good. God would have given us marriage for the purpose of raising children. From Aquinas' point of view, having children is good for us, right? It is good for us to have a legacy, have children, and it is one of the great joys of human life to have children. But not only that, being married is good for the children, right? So marriage is good for us because it's the setting in which we can have children. But marriage is also, of course, good for the children because it is the setting in which they can have a flourishing, stable upbringing. Okay, so even if we had never fallen, even if we were still in the original state of human nature before the fall of humanity, marriage would still be good. But now that we are fallen, marriage is good for another reason too, which is marriage provides an outlet, an acceptable outlet for lust. This gets into the very pessimistic view of the sexual impulse that I pointed out last time, that you can find not only in Aquinas, but really in the entire Christian tradition. You find it in one of the church fathers, Augustine, as well as in many other church fathers, and you find it in the Bible as well. And this pessimistic view is that we're burdened by sexual desire. We're burdened by concupiscence, right? Sexual desire is something that is unpleasant, that is bad for us. It degrades us, right? It overwhelms our rational faculties, and for some time, right, while we're under its sway, makes us into animals. And so it's bad for us to feel sexual desire. It's a bad state to be in. But and this sexual desire makes it very hard for us not to sin, right? We feel overwhelming sexual desire, and we're going to end up sinning. And if we end up sinning outside of marriage, outside of a context where it's okay to raise children, well, that's going to be a very grave sin. And so one of the things that marriage is good for is that it gives us a setting in which we can have an outlet for our excessive sexual desire, for our excessive concupiscence, where it is less grave, right? Where it's less of a moral failing if we end up having sex. Okay, so if you read a lot of early Christian philosophers, actually, if you read the Bible itself, it's very clear that one of the goods of marriage, one of the reasons it's good to get married, is that it provides a context in which it's not as bad to commit sexual sins. It's not as bad to have sex out of lust. And so Aquinas' perspective here is lust is always a sin, right? Having sex just for the sake of pleasure is always a sin. But if you do it outside of marriage, that's going to be a mortal sin. Why? Well, not only is it against the natural order of things, but it also injures someone, right? It injures your potential child. Whereas if you commit an act of lust, if you have sex for the sake of pleasure within a marriage, that's only a venial sin, right? It's a less bad sin. It's less grave as a sin. Why? Well, again, of course, it's still against the rational order of things, right? You're still having sex over and above the amount of sex you need to have in order to reproduce yourself. And so it's still a kind of violation of the natural order, but at least it doesn't harm anybody, right? You're at least doing it within a context where it's going to be okay if you end up producing a child. And so for that reason, it's merely a venial sin. It's a sin that is, although it's still impermissible, right? A sin is impermissible, it's tolerable. Okay, it's not as bad. And so one of the goods of marriage is that it converts the mortal sin of lust that we're all prone to, or that almost all of us are prone to, into a mere venial sin. Right? So again, it's still sinful, still impermissible, but not as bad. Now, of course, here we're talking about, a heterosexual monogamous marriage that you can't get out of. Right? That's the context where having sex is okay, according to Aquinas. It's got to be heterosexual because that's what you need in order to produce children, right? It's got to be monogamous and long lasting because that's the context in which it's okay to have children. Okay. So this gives you a glimpse of Christian sexual ethics or Christian marital ethics, and the kind of marital ethics, the kind of ethics of marriage that Aquinas has in mind here. The first is that within this kind of marriage, of course, you have to be monogamous. Okay? You have to be faithful to your spouse. Adultery, which is having sex with somebody else when you're married to someone, is a mortal sin. Notice, by the way, this is new. You don't have this in ancient Greece. Okay, there isn't much of an expectation, if any expectation at all, in ancient Greece, that you be monogamous, even if you're married. Right? We saw it was quite common for married men, for example, to have sex with younger boys if they were their mentors. It was also quite common, I don't think I mentioned this, for older men to have sex with prostitutes. So in ancient Greece, we don't, again, we don't know everything, but from what we can tell, it seems like there wasn't much, if any, of an expectation of monogamy within marriage. And this, of course, was connected to the lower status of women, right? As a man, you don't owe your wife to be monogamous to her. And this is why the fact that in Christianity marriage was expected to be monogamous is why in the early days of Christianity women just flocked to it. Okay, women just flocked to Christianity in the early days of Christianity because, as I pointed out to you in our lectures on love as unmotivated concern, you had a kind of equality here, right? Here were Christians telling women that they were equally important in the eyes of God and that they were owed equal respect and that their husband had to give them equal respect and couldn't be out having sex with other people. This was, this was new in the Western tradition, and it's something that women really flocked to. This idea that if they were Christian and they got married to a man, that man had to be faithful to them, right? That they had to remain monogamous. And so it was in many ways much more egalitarian than the kind of relationship you found between the sexes in ancient Greece. Right? It still wasn't egalitarian. Women in the Christian world and medieval Christianity did not have the same rights as men, did not have the same political status as men, and couldn't really participate in public life in various ways. But this was much more of a status, much more of an equal standing than you found in ancient Greece. And so that's one part of the Christian sexual ethic that I want to highlight. The other big part of the Christian sexual ethic I want to highlight is that within Christianity, it's understood that spouses have a marital debt to each other. And this is not just within Christianity, really. It's within marriage in, I think, most cultures and most times. But the idea is that spouses have a duty to make themselves sexually available to each other. Again, this connects up with the pessimistic view of sexuality that I just mentioned, right? We are, in our fallen state, burdened with concupiscence. We can't help it. We feel very strong sexual desire, even though we shouldn't, and we have a lot of trouble controlling our animal urges, right? This is part of the punishment for the first sin. And so now we're driven to have sex even when it's not morally permissible. And what you get married for, one of the reasons you get married for, is so that you don't end up committing mortal sin by having sex outside of marriage. Okay, and so when you agree to marry someone, you agree to take care of their sexual urges, right? You're there in order to do that. Because if you don't, well, they're going to end up masturbating or something, and that's a mortal sin. Okay, and so you as a spouse have a debt, a marital debt, a duty to take care of your partner's sexual urges, that is, to make yourself sexually available to your partner. Now, notice, um, sometimes students misunderstand it. Actually, sometimes the general public misunderstands this. Um, to say that you have a duty to do something is not to say that you don't need to consent for it to be okay. Okay, so if you've promised me to do something, we would say you have a duty to do it. It is morally obligatory for you to fulfill your promise, subject to certain conditions, right? Again, maybe there are other obligations that have to take precedence or whatever, but generally speaking, you have a moral obligation to do what you promised to do. But that doesn't mean that that is morally permissible for me to force you to do the thing that you said you'd do, like at gunpoint or something, or to force you to do it against your will, right? So to say that spouses have a duty to take care of each other's sexual impulses is not the same thing as saying that they can have sex with their partner, with their spouse, without their consent. If it's not the same thing. Um, the best life, of course, from a Christian perspective, is one where you just don't have lust, right? Where you don't engage in sex for the sake of just for the sake of pleasure. One where you manage to control your sexual impulses, to repress, to contain your sexual impulses. But of course, not everybody can do that. It's very difficult. And so, while both spouses should aim to completely contain their sexual impulses and never engage in acts of lust, to the extent that one of them can't, the other should make themselves sexually available, within reason. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, so that's what Aquinas has to say about the Christian marital ethic. Now, let's move on to the main event, really, which is the concept of sexual perversion. And again, I know I'm repeating myself here, but a perversion is something that is unnatural. It's something that is against nature. It's a distortion or a deformity of nature. And you talk about perversions outside of the sexual domain too, right? You might talk about a perversion of justice. What's that? Well, it's something that twists or that distorts or that deforms justice, right? That's what that is. Similarly, a sexual perversion is something that is unnatural. It's something that twists or that deforms or that distorts the nature of the sexual act, right? When you call somebody a pervert, what you're saying is that their sex drive in some way it twists or it distorts or it deforms the nature of the sexual act. Okay, this, by the way, is what Aquinas calls unnatural vice, okay, or the unnatural vices. And here in the Summa Theologica, in the part of the Summa Theologica that I got you to read, he's asking the question, are the unnatural vices, right? Is unnatural vice a variety of lust? Okay, remember, lust for Aquinas, sex for the sake of pleasure. That is, are the unnatural vices, the perversions, a variety of lust? Are they a variety of the sin of acting on sexual desire? And his answer here is yes, of course. But that's not what interests us. Okay, what really interests us here is going to be what kinds of things he thinks are unnatural and why. And that's what we're going to look at now. What kinds of things Aquinas thinks are unnatural, what kinds of sexual acts he thinks are unnatural, and why he thinks that. Okay, here is the quotation. He says, some sins, besides being contrary to right reason, are in addition contrary to the natural order of the sexual act as becoming to the human race. Okay, so these sins he's talking about, of course, are contrary to right reason, right? That's what makes them sins, as we saw. Aquinas is a natural law theorist. He thinks that what makes an action right or wrong is whether it corresponds to the order that is there in things, right? The rational order that we can perceive and that God put there in the nature of things. So, of course, these things, these unnatural sins, they're going to be contrary to right reason. But not only are they contrary to right reason, in addition to that, they're contrary to the natural order of the sexual act. Okay, and this is what he's calling the unnatural vice or the unnatural vices. Okay, vices, sexual vices, actions that are wrong that pertain to what is sexual, that are in addition unnatural. Why are they unnatural? Well, because they're contrary to the natural order of the sexual act in a way that I'll explain. Okay, he lists a few things here. He says this may happen in several ways, right? This here meaning unnatural vice. It can happen in several ways. First, by procuring orgasm via masturbation. That's the sin that he calls uncleanliness. You'll also see the word onanism. Okay, onanism is a synonym for masturbation that is used a lot in the tradition, really, all the way up to Kant. You'll see when we read Kant, he talks about onanism. He means by this masturbation. Secondly, Aquinas says, by copulation with a thing of undue species, and this is called bestiality. Thirdly, by copulation with an undue sex, male with male or female with female, and this is called the vice of sodomy. And then fourthly, by not observing the natural manner of copulation, either as to undue means or as to other monstrous and bestial manners of copulation. What is he talking about here? And why is he saying that these things, right? He's listing four things here, are unnatural. The four things that he's listing are masturbation, same-sex relations, what he's calling sodomy, anal and oral sex, okay, that's what he's talking about by undue means or monstrous and bestial manners of copulation. And then finally, bestiality. Okay, he's listing four things here. And he's saying these four things are contrary to the natural order of the sexual act. What does he mean? Well, as I pointed out last time, from his perspective, all natural entities have a built-in telos, right? A built-in aim or purpose or function. And the built-in telos of the sexual organs is to reproduce. So the human sexual faculty, the human sexual instinct, is by nature, according to Aquinas, aimed at a particular kind of act, which involves a particular organ of somebody of a particular sex, which belongs to a particular species. Okay, all these kinds of things are built into, Aquinas thinks, the human sexual impulse because of the aim that's built into the human sexual impulse. And so any sexual act that's going to deviate from that is going to be unnatural. And that's what he thinks happens in the case of masturbation, in the case of oral and anal sex, in the case of same-sex relations, or what he's calling sodomy, and in the case of bestiality. All these actions fail to conform to the purpose or to the aim of sexuality. That is, they're either not aimed at the right organs, or they're aimed at the organs of somebody of the wrong sex, or they're aimed at somebody of the wrong species, okay, or a being of the wrong species. And that's what makes them perversions, right? That's what makes them distortions or deformities of nature. So he's listed four things here, and they're all mortal sins, he thinks, but they're not all as bad. Okay? They're not all sinful to the same degree. Now, I don't know if you noticed this. In the paper, in the excerpt I got you to read, some of what Aquinas says elsewhere in the Summa is stuck in a footnote. Okay, this is how I'm testing if you're attentive readers. If you read the footnote, I think it's the last footnote in the excerpt, you'll see there's a quote from Aquinas where he explains that these four things he thinks are all mortal sins, but they're not all as bad. Okay, so you got four perversions here, and they're all bad. They're all morally impermissible, but they're not all as bad. Okay, so here's a useful diagram. So here's a knight, the knight that we've seen before. Suppose that it's just him with himself, and he's thinking of masturbating, or he engages in masturbation. Again, another word for this is onanism. We'll see this word later. According to Aquinas, this is morally impermissible. Okay, this is wrong. This is a mortal sin. It is a grave moral failing. But not only is it a grave moral failing, it is a perversion. Okay, so it's not just a mortal sin. It belongs to the category of mortal sins that are sexual perversions. Why? Well, think about it. According to Aquinas, the sexual impulse has an object by nature. And it is aimed at a particular action with that object. Again, genital contact, right? By nature, the human sexual impulse aims at genital contact with a human being of the opposite sex. The problem with masturbation is there is no object. Okay, there is no object. It's not directed at any particular kind of person. It's not an act that is directed at another person. It's just you with yourself. Okay, and it's not like you're the object, right? You're not like penetrating yourself or something when you masturbate. There just is no object. It lacks an object. According to Aquinas, this is, of course, a mortal sin. It is a particular kind of mortal sin, namely an unnatural vice that is a sexual perversion, but it's the least bad of the mortal sins. Okay, concretely speaking, what this means is um, it's tolerated to a very high degree. So especially if you're not married in the medieval period, and in Catholic communities to this day, if you masturbate, it's bad. You're not supposed to do it, but you go see a priest, and the priest, largely understands, and he just tells you, try to pray more, so that you do it less. Okay, it's bad, but it's not very, very bad. Now, next up, suppose that there's this knight. And suppose that this knight goes up to this noblewoman here. He's on his knees. He's propositioning her, my lady, could I please? I'm not going to finish that sentence, but suppose that he's propositioning her for oral or anal sex. Okay. Now, according to Aquinas, of course, this is again mortal sin, right? This isn't sex for the sake of producing children, nor is it in a relationship where it'd be okay to have children, right? This is just a random noblewoman. But as a perversion, it's worse than masturbation, but it's not as bad as it could be. Okay, so again, it's mortal sin. It's morally impermissible. But here it is a slight distortion of the proper aim or object of sex. Okay, because again, the proper aim of sex is reproduction. That's its telos or function. And so for that reason, it's aimed at a person of the opposite sex, and specifically at a particular action, which is genital contact with a person of the opposite sex. So oral and anal sex with a person of the opposite sex, well, you've got the species right. It's a human being at least. And you've got the sex right? It's a person of the opposite sex. This knight here, in propositioning this noblewoman, at least is getting her sex right. But he is drawn to the wrong organ. Okay, so there's a distortion there of the sexual impulse. Notice the cross I've got there, the X, is bigger, right? This is worse. They're both mortal sins, but masturbation is not as bad as anal or oral sex. And notice this would remain a perversion and also remain a mortal sin if this knight happened to be married to this noblewoman, right? Why? Well, this would be an act of lust, because you can't conceive children by having anal or oral sex. That doesn't work. I don't know if you've tried it. It doesn't work. And so it is a moral sin, and it is moreover a perversion. Okay, now suppose you've got this knight, and now instead of propositioning this noblewoman, he's propositioning this king. This is, a same-sex relation. This is what Aquinas calls, and what, has been called in the past, sodomy. This, again, according to Aquinas, is a perversion. Right? It's a distortion, a deformity of the sexual act or the sexual impulse, because it's aiming at the wrong object. Right? What you should be aiming at is a person of the opposite sex, and specifically, again, you should be aiming at a particular action with them, right? Genital contact with a human being of the opposite sex. Well, here, this is again morally impermissible. Right? Of course, it's an act of lust. You can't conceive children this way. This is an act for the sake of sexual pleasure and not for the sake of reproduction. But beyond that, it's a perversion. And why is it a perversion? Well, look, you might have got the species right, but here you've got the wrong sex. Okay, and for that reason, also, of course, the wrong organ. Okay? The knight, in being drawn to a sexual activity of any kind, should be drawn to genital contact with a woman. But this man is not a woman and does not have the right set of genitals. And so this is going to be not only a mortal sin, but a perversion, right? A twisting, a distortion, a deformity of the sexual impulse. And again, I've made the X there, the cross, a little bit bigger, right? This is worse. Right? Masturbation, it's a mortal sin, it's a perversion. But as far as mortal sins go, it's pretty okay. Anal oral sex, okay, this is not okay. Sodomy, this is really not okay. And then, according to Aquinas, the worst of the perversions is bestiality. Okay, so suppose you've got this knight, he sees this dog, this poor dog, who is there through no fault of its own, um, and the knight wants to engage in sexual intercourse with this dog. Now, this is, of course, again, impermissible. It's a sin. Not only is it a sin, it's a mortal sin. Not only is it a mortal sin, but like all these other things, it is a perversion of the sexual impulse. It distorts the nature of the sexual impulse because it is aimed at the wrong kind of act with a person or with an entity, I should say, not only of the wrong sex, but also of the wrong species, right? Whoa, very distorted. You haven't even got the species right. Okay, that's how far you are from the correct act with the correct person, with the correct object. You're not even drawn to the right species. Okay, so here you have a very severe distortion of nature. And so what you find in Aquinas is, and what you find in the Christian tradition generally, really, is like a hierarchy of perversions, right? Masturbation is at the bottom. It's not that bad compared to the others. Oral and anal sex, okay, it's pretty bad. Same-sex relations, sodomy, okay, that's really bad. And bestiality, that is very, very bad. Okay, that is the worst kind. Okay, so that is the concept of perversion as you find it in Aquinas, as you find it in the medieval Christian tradition, and again, as you find it to this day in Roman Catholicism, right, in Roman Christianity, which is the biggest branch of Christianity worldwide, as well as in other branches of Christianity. This is how they think about it. It's also how they think about it, by the way, in other religions, right? Other religions that have this kind of natural law understanding of what makes things right and wrong. Now, let's move on to our analysis of Aquinas' treatise on the cardinal virtues. Again, as when we were doing our first unit, what I want to do here is talk on the one hand about the ethics of sex, okay, sexual ethics, as you find it in Aquinas, and then about the metaphysics of sex, right? Sexual metaphysics as you find it in Aquinas, and especially the relation between these two things. Okay, that's what's going to interest us primarily, not only today, but also going forward. Okay, how ideas about ethics change as ideas about metaphysics change. Okay, this is the story that I'm telling you as we're moving from the Middle Ages into the modern period, is how our understanding of metaphysics change, our understanding of the world changes, and how that brings with it a difference in our understanding about ethics, and of course, for this class specifically, about sexual ethics. So first, Aquinas' sexual ethics. So here I've got what I think is a useful chart to help you navigate how Aquinas, and more broadly the Christian tradition, thinks about sexual ethics. So as we've seen, the only kinds of sexual acts that are not sinful at all, according to Aquinas, are sexual acts that are not acts of lust. That is to say, they're sexual acts that are not performed for the sake of sexual pleasure, right? You're not having sex for the pleasure. Instead, you're having sex for reproduction. Okay, that is the only kind of sex that is not sinful at all. Every other kind of sex is an act of lust, right? Any act of sex where you're doing it for the sake of the pleasure is an act of lust. But as we saw last time, within the medieval Christian tradition, within Roman Catholicism to this day, there are two different kinds of sin. The first is venial sin, which is a lesser sin, right? A sin that is less morally bad. And there's mortal sin, which is a very grave sin, a sin that is very morally bad. According to Aquinas, acts of lust are only venial sins, right? They're not as bad if they're performed within marriage. Why? Well, again, the sexual act is producing a child. And so even though an act of lust is always contrary to the rational order of things, right? It's always using your sexual organs for something else than their purpose. At least if you're doing it within a marriage, well, you're not going to injure the child whom you create. And so it's morally permissible. Okay, but notice, as I've got on my slide here, your sexual act has to be at least open to reproduction. In the medieval Christian tradition, in the Roman Catholic view to this day, using protection of any kind is always a mortal sin. Okay, your sexual organs are made for reproduction. If you use them for something else than reproduction, namely for pleasure, As long as you remain open to reproduction, that's okay. But you can't pose an obstacle to reproduction. That is, you can't use birth control of any kind. You can't use protection of any kind. Condoms are a mortal sin. The birth control pill is a mortal sin if it's being used to prevent reproduction and not, to prevent health problems. And even just pulling out is a mortal sin. Okay, so it's a venial sin only if it's one within marriage and two at the same time open to reproduction. Any other act of lust is a mortal sin. Okay, so under the category of mortal sin here, I've got fornication, that's sex outside of marriage, right? So if you hook up with somebody, that's fornication. If you've got a serious partner who you have sex with, but you're not married, that's fornication. And I've also got adultery. Adultery is sex outside of marriage when you're married, right? So sex with somebody else than your spouse. So if you're married and you cheat on your spouse, that's adultery. If you're married and you hire the services of a prostitute, that's adultery. Okay, those are mortal sins. They're very, very grave sins. It's also, as I just pointed out, a mortal sin to use contraception, even within a marriage, right? Even within a marriage, it's going to be a mortal sin to use condoms or the birth control pill, or even just the pull-out method. Okay, that is a mortal sin. But then within the category of mortal sin, you have a further category, which is the sexual perversions. And those include the ones that we've seen. Masturbation, anal and oral sex, same-sex sexual relations, and then bestiality. I want to stress here, this is important. This is a source of confusion in the general public. Being gay, right, being homosexual is not a sin from the Christian perspective. You're not doing anything wrong just by being attracted to somebody of your own sex. Of course not. That doesn't make any sense, okay? What is a sin is sodomy. What is a sin is same-sex sexual activity. That's what's a sin. Okay. Again, we're all fallen beings. We have sexual urges that we're not supposed to have. Some people have sexual urges toward people of their own sex. But from a Christian perspective, those urges are not themselves sins. We can't control those. Right? What we're supposed to do is not act on them. And so what is a sin here? When I say sodomy for Aquinas is a sin, or when I say that same-sex relations for Aquinas are a sin, I'm not saying that same-sex attraction is a sin. That's not a sin, okay? Nobody has ever thought that was a sin. What is thought to be a sin is acting on that. So let's illustrate all this. Let's take this couple, and let's imagine that they're married. Okay, suppose that this man is married with this woman, and suppose that they want to have sex for the sake of reproduction, right? Both of them recognize that they should reproduce, and they should leave some heirs. So in that case, it's going to be permissible for them to have sex. Okay. This is, in fact, the only case in which Aquinas thinks it would be permissible for two people to have sex, morally permissible, i.e., not sinful. Now, imagine this other scenario where, again, these two people are married. Okay, they are married, but the wife is subject to uncontrollable sexual impulse. Okay, she wants to have sex with her husband for pleasure because her sexual desire, her concupiscence, is just uncontrollable. Well, according to Aquinas, as we've seen, this would be obligatory, right? The husband has a general obligation to satisfy his wife's sexual needs. Now, of course, there are exceptions. If the husband is sick, that's an okay excuse. If it's a holy day, you must not, right? If it's Christmas or Easter, you absolutely must not engage in sexual activity from a Catholic perspective. But generally speaking, there's an obligation for him to take care of his wife's sexual needs. And of course, if it's obligatory, it's also permissible, right? If it's obligatory for him to take care of his wife's sexual needs, where he's not the one engaging in sex for pleasure, he's just doing it for her, that's going to be permissible as well. So I've got here a thought bubble. He's just thinking about his good Christian duty, right? He's not in it for the pleasure, but he's going to take care of her sexual needs for her sake, because that's what he promised to do in marrying her. Of course, again, he's going to feel pleasure while doing this. That's inevitable. But that's not sinful, because he's not engaging in it for the sake of pleasure. He's engaging in it out of a sense of duty, right? To fulfill his marital duties. What about everything else? Everything else is impermissible. So if you take these two people, imagine that they're not married and they want to have sex for the sake of pleasure. That's impermissible. Imagine they are married. Imagine they want to have sex for the sake of pleasure. That's impermissible. Imagine that this man, this king, is attracted to his knight, he wants to have sex with him for the sake of pleasure. That's impermissible, mortal sin, and also perverted. Imagine this guy is so depraved that he's attracted to his family dog, wants to have sex with him for the sake of pleasure. Again, impermissible, and also, again, very, very perverted. Okay, this is all going to be morally impermissible. So not only is, our bestiality and sodomy, so same-sex relations, morally impermissible, but anal and oral sex with your own spouse is morally impermissible, and even just sex out of lust, right? Sex for the sake of pleasure, morally impermissible. Not as bad as if it were outside of a marriage, but still impermissible. Okay, so what you have here is a very, very restrictive view of sexual ethics. Okay, arguably, I think the Catholic sexual ethic has got to be one of the most restrictive ones that has ever been thought up. Okay, it's a very, very restrictive sexual ethic. And as I've already pointed out, it's related to a very pessimistic view of the human sexual impulse. And we saw metaphysical sexual pessimism is a kind of negative attitude toward the human sexual impulse. Now, Aquinas thinks that human sexuality is good, right? It has a built-in aim that is good, which is reproduction. But at the same time, because of our fallen state, we have sexual desires that go well above and beyond what is necessary to reproduce, right? We're subject to concupiscence. And because we're subject to concupiscence, we are inclined toward doing things that are morally wrong. We're inclined towards sin, right? We have an inclination toward excess. We want to have sex. We have desire for more sex than is necessary for us to reproduce. So the human sexual impulse is, for all of us in our fallen state, disordered. Okay, that's the view of sexuality that Aquinas has. Now, again, he thinks that the best kind of life is one where we manage to contain it to such a degree that we never act on it. But of course, for most of us, that's not going to be possible. Okay, and so what we need to do is to get married so that we have an outlet for our sexual passions that is not as bad. So you've got this metaphysical view in the background here, which is a kind of pessimism about the human sexual impulse. But that's not all there is to it. There's more to Aquinas's sexual metaphysic than simply a pessimistic view of the human sexual impulse. What there is, in addition, is a teleological view of nature. As we saw last time, Aquinas takes for granted, and really just about everybody in the Middle Ages took it for granted, that natural entities have purposes. Right? They have every natural entity has a telos, that is an aim or function or purpose. And understanding any natural entity involves finding out what its natural aim or function or purpose, what its telos is. And that underlies both Aquinas's general sexual ethic, right? What he thinks is morally permissible, impermissible, and obligatory within sexual relations. And more specifically, it informs how he understands the sexual perversions. Now, there are various different ways that you can present Aquinas' argument here, but one way that I think will be particularly useful to us might go like this. So the first premise of the argument would be something like, actions that fail to accord with the rational order of things are sinful. And this, I hope you'll recognize, is simply Aquinas' natural law perspective. Right? As we've seen, there are different normative ethical theories, different theories about what makes an action right or wrong. And one such theory, the one that Aquinas espouses, is a natural law theory. And according to natural law theories of ethics, what makes an action right or wrong is whether it accords with or violates the rational order of things. In Aquinas' case, the idea is whether it accords with or violates the rational order that was placed into nature by God. Okay, that's what makes an action right or wrong, according to Aquinas. Now, the second premise might be something like masturbation, oral sex, anal sex, sodomy, and bestiality, right? The different things that Aquinas calls sexual perversions deviate from the natural aim of the sexual organs. And what you find here is simply Aquinas' teleological view of nature, right? The view that natural entities, including here our sexual organs, have a built-in aim or purpose or function, a built-in telos. And the built-in telos is to reproduce, right? And since that is the built-in telos, the built-in aim, our sexual organs have a built-in object, right? They're directed toward a particular kind of action or particular kind of act with a particular kind of entity, namely um, genital contact with a human being of the opposite sex. Masturbation, oral sex, anal sex, sodomy, and bestiality all deviate from that proper act with that proper object. And then you could add as a third premise, well, actions that deviate from the natural aim of the sexual organs, right? Actions like masturbation, oral sex, anal sex, sodomy, and bestiality fail to accord with the rational order of things. And this is, again, just part of how Aquinas understands what it is to accord with the rational order of things. It's to accord with the purpose that God put into things. Now, if these three premises are true, what follows? Right? If it's true that any action that fails to accord with the rational order of things is sinful, and if it's true that masturbation, oral sex, anal sex, sodomy, and bestiality deviate from the natural aim of the sexual organs, and if it's true that anything that deviates from that natural aim also fails to accord with the natural order of things, right? If it's true that it violates the natural order of things, what follows? Well, masturbation, oral sex, anal sex, sodomy, and bestiality are sinful. Okay, this is his conclusion. This is one way to represent what he's saying. So if these three premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows. Okay, this is what's called, again, a deductive argument. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. And so, if you're going to critique this argument, right, if you're going to disagree with this conclusion, if you think any one of these things is not sinful, that is, if you think any one of these things is not morally wrong, it must be that you think one of these premises or more, right, one or more of these premises is incorrect. And so if we're going to critique this argument, we have to show which one of these premises we think is incorrect. And there's a couple of ways that you can challenge this argument. One way that you could challenge this argument is by saying, well, I don't think premise 2 is true. Okay, I don't think it's true that masturbation, oral sex, anal sex, sodomy, and bestiality deviate from the natural aim of the sexual organs. You might say, right, one way to challenge this premise is by saying the sexual organs don't have a natural aim because nothing has a natural aim. Okay, so one way you can go in critiquing this argument, one way you might go is arguing that as a matter of fact, natural entities don't have built-in aims, right? They don't have an aim or purpose or function. They don't have a telos. Another way that you might go is by saying, okay, well, maybe they do have a telos, but I don't think that failing to accord with that telos, right, failing to accord with that purpose is what makes an action right or wrong. In that case, you'd be challenging the first premise, right? You'd be saying, well, look, I don't actually think that failing to accord with the natural purposes of things or with any kind of rational order of things is what makes an action right or wrong. Okay, so in other words, two ways that you can try and challenge what Aquinas is saying here are first, by challenging his teleological view of nature, and second, by challenging his natural law theory. Okay, that's two ways you can go to challenge this argument. And lo and behold, this is exactly what people begin to do in the modern period. Okay, when we move from the Middle Ages to modernity, what we're going to see in the next few lectures is that people start to come to a very different understanding of the natural world from the one that you find in Aquinas. The most important detail for us is that people stop thinking that things have an inherent purpose, okay, that natural entities have an inherent purpose. Of course, not everybody stops thinking this, but at least it stops being part of scientific inquiry into the natural world, okay? We drop teleology as a part of scientific inquiry. And then also during the modern period, in part because of this, philosophers start to develop different theories about what makes an action right or wrong that doesn't depend on the idea that there's a rational order in the natural world. And so this is when you see people developing different systems of ethics, like, for example, Kantian ethics and utilitarian ethics, which we're going to talk about in the next few lectures. Okay, so keep all this in mind, because what we're going to see in the next few lectures is how our understanding of sexual immorality changes over the modern period, right? Changes in the transition from the medieval to the modern period, and how that happens in part because of a change in our understanding of nature, right? It's a change in our understanding of metaphysics, of what the world is like. That's where we're headed. So for today, we're going to end here. Here, as always, is a quick recap. According to Aquinas' sexual ethics, all acts of lust are sinful. Okay? Any act where you're having sex for the purpose of gaining sexual pleasure is always a sin. This includes fornication, it includes adultery, and it even includes lust within a marriage. Though, of course, fornication and adultery are mortal sins, whereas lust within a marriage is merely a venial sin. The perversions are acts that distort the nature of the sexual faculty, and for that reason, they are also sinful. Okay, for Aquinas, this includes masturbation, anal sex, oral sex, same-sex relations, right, what he calls sodomy, and bestiality. And as I've pointed out, this whole thing, this whole understanding of sexual ethics depends on a teleological view of nature. It depends on the view that natural entities have purposes, right? They're organized with a view of certain purposes. They're put together in such a way as to achieve certain purposes. And the sexual organs are put together in such a way as to reproduce. Okay, this is what Aquinas' natural law understanding of ethics, and especially of sexual ethics, depends on the view that there are purposes in things. And as I just pointed out, this is a view that will be increasingly challenged as we move from the medieval period, right, from medieval Christianity into the modern period, into secular modernity. And that's what we're going to talk about next time. Until then, bye.